welcome back to Repairing Earth. This is your host, Emily Cristobal, and today we are joined by Kevin Petrini of the United Nations Development Program. He's a Deputy Resident Representative for the Federated States of Micronesia, and he joins us to discuss his work out here in the Pacific and the importance of highlighting and preserving these island communities.
Yeah, it's so great to be here. Thanks for, getting in touch. Yes, this is great.
Yeah, first off, I was hoping if you could tell me a little bit about your role as a UN diplomat and what your main objectives are in serving the community.
Yeah, look, I had recently wrote a small piece and it talked about coming to the Pacific in 1998 as a United States Peace Corps volunteer. And while I was there in Samoa for 2 years, in 98 to 2000, I learned the saying, and the saying says, "Ole ala, ole pule, ole tautua." And the saying is around the road to authority is through service. And it's that service that I have been dedicated my life to in the Pacific on climate and environment. And now I'm here, working in my role in the UN as the country manager here, covering the 5 countries in the North Pacific, here sitting in Pohnpei in the Federated States of Micronesia, but also covering Palau, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, and Nauru. So yeah, the main objectives of what we're trying to do can be summarized in these 5 Ps. So it's planet, peace, prosperity, people, and then everything done in partnerships. So these are a very broad range of what we do. And obviously, I think today we're really focusing on that planet piece of the puzzle. But of course, we do a lot on promoting peace and building prosperity for people in the Pacific.
Yeah, that's super awesome. And for people who are listening and aren't too familiar with where exactly you are in the Pacific, can you describe the area where you're overseeing?
Yeah, so I am pretty much halfway between Hawaii and the Philippines, in a small island called Pohnpei. Pohnpei is a beautiful island. It's a bit smaller than the Hawaiian Islands. It's a beautiful place. It's surrounded by mangroves, not a high population here, so there's not even a stoplight on the island. And you can drive around it in a couple hours. So just a very beautiful cultural place, yes.
Totally. I wanted to talk a little bit about your background, how you first arrived in the Pacific in 1998 as a Peace Corps volunteer in Samoa. And, fast forward to your role now. What has this experience been like? And, what changes have you seen over the years?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, at this point, I've never left. I came in 98, and I won't go into this side of it, but it's a love story. And so I have not left the Pacific since. So I spent 10 years in Polynesia, 10 years in Melanesia, and now I'm into my 3rd year in Micronesia. And so I've really had the privilege of serving the entire Pacific and seeing the change in the Pacific over this time. And what's interesting to me is a few different things. In the late 90s when I was here, and I'm talking now, from a development perspective, there were actually no policies or limited policies and plans that actually focused on climate and environment. People, of course, were very protective of their environment, but these policies and plans weren't there. And then in the 2000s, they started developing climate change policies and plans. And then, now we're here in 2024, all the policies and plans that are, governments here in the Pacific have this climate environment strongly in the center as it needs to be for their sustainable future. So what I've seen is a real change in the narrative from it just being a small kind of side discussion around the environment to front and center in terms of the importance and that it is a climate emergency and that we do need to look at it from a security point of view, and that climate security whether it's for food or water or even, against conflict. All these things are super important. So yes, I've seen so much over the years in that evolution of the ability to act and combat climate change in the Pacific. And it should be noted that the Pacific is so active in combating climate change because it's a necessity. It has to be there. And that needs to be complemented by the global community as well, particularly on the reduction of greenhouse gases. And so, we can do so much here in the Pacific, but the globe needs to act collectively as well too. So to me, that's the real importance of acting locally, but also acting globally as well.
I totally agree with what you're saying. The matter of fact is, some of the world's richest countries are the top polluters of greenhouse gases, but it's often the smallest countries that are seeing the biggest impacts of climate change, whether it be sea level rise, warming temperatures, and all these other aspects. And I was hoping before we go on to other questions, if you could explain what exactly the global community can do to help out these islands in the Pacific.
Yeah, no, great question. And first things first is that listening to what's happening, genuinely, let's hear the stories of the Pacific, what is happening, because, we're seeing those impacts now. And frankly, these impacts are not just located in the Pacific, they are happening globally. You may not be seeing them as directly at the moment, or maybe you are, but the fact is, here it is, and it's every day, and it's in our face. So I think listening, and kind of in a way, you're looking into the future of the rest of the globe and what's going to happen. So that's so important. And what we really do need is the global community to come together around the reduction of greenhouse gases. These annual conference of parties that we hold every year under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change are critical places and points in time to set the right agenda in the right direction. And so recently, for the first time, just this past December, fossil fuels, that word was actually used in the outcome statement of the meeting. And so, we've been talking about fossil fuels and the issues associated with them for years, but it's the first time it got in there. And I think that's a really important point. And so advocacy at that global level to make sure that that meeting is setting the right direction for our future is critical, not just for everyone, but especially here in the Pacific.
Absolutely. I feel like language is very important when it comes to topics like these. Obviously, we see things like greenwashing, where companies will sometimes use these phrases that make a product sound good, but when you really pinpoint the issue and the problem and call it what it is, that can make a huge difference.
Yeah. And one of the things the Pacific has been so strong on is advocating for this 1.5 to stay alive. I don't know if you've ever heard this phrase, but this was used, and we hear a lot about the Paris Agreement in 2015. And it was actually enshrined in that agreement in 2015, this 1.5 degrees. And it was the slogan coming out of the Pacific and small island states of the world saying 1.5 to stay alive. And so this really becomes the rally call for what we need to be doing. So it's so critical that we be working both in that adaptation space, which is dealing with the local impacts, but also mitigating it. And so actually, stopping those greenhouse gases from getting into the atmosphere in the first place.
Yeah, that's really great. To see how big of an impact these islands in the middle of the Pacific can have on the world. Just learning about these things, like you said, listening to their voices, listening to their stories. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the threats that these islands in the Pacific face when it comes to climate change and natural disasters.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I can bring up maybe two projects that we're working on. I really think we need what I say climate change adaptation at scale. So, I think there's been a lot of adaptation actions that have happened, and that's great. But we need to do it at a way that's going to transform our way of thinking and our behavior so that we can be sustainable with these climate impacts happening. So there's two projects that we're doing at scale in adaptation that I'd like to share about. So the first one, I bring you to the amazing atoll island of Tuvalu, which I've had the privilege of going many times. It's just an amazing place on this earth. They are an atoll, as I mentioned, and an atoll, for your listeners, it's a very low-lying island. So, the highest points are just a few feet above sea level on the entire country. So it's not just one island, but the entire country is just a few feet above sea level. So what we did is, of course, Tuvaluans have known for a long time, and actually they were some of the first advocates in the 80s on climate change, starting to talk about it. And they've known this issue of sea level rise. They're living it, they're seeing it every day, and they're seeing, the sea level rise and the impacts. So we had the honor to work with Tuvalu to actually do a pilot to raise part of the island. So we're raising the island. We're raising the island over 6 feet in this about 16 acres of land. And so that 16 acres of land that's rising up 6 feet is now safe, looking at the projections up to 2100. So this creates safe space for people to, have that future that they're looking for. And what's really fascinating to me was that project, we really needed the best science possible to underpin it. And so it was that combination of science and data that then gave us the ability to design something with Tuvalu to say, this is what needs to be done. Then they did it. And it's now this piece of land that is now has risen out of the sea and has that safe space. But honestly, this is just the beginning. And by having the proof of concept that we could do that in Tuvalu, now there's this idea for a long-term adaptation. How can you take that idea and then bring that out to 2100, not just for that little piece of land, but for the entire island? And so we worked with them on that side to do that long-term planning. And so to me, that project really shows the transformational potential for a project to say, okay, a proof of concept, we can get this done. Now we need to work with the global community to scale it. So to me, that is, a really exciting project that we're working on. I'll talk about another one as well. This one is in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, so actually a little bit closer to Hawaii. It's around water security and water resilience. So going to this drought issue that many islands are facing as well. And in this one, what the design criteria is that noting particularly during the 2015-16 El Nino, which we're on in El Nino now, during that time, there were drought conditions in the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And so we worked with the Marshall Islands government to design a program that would help try to alleviate that here in the future. And here we are in the future, and we have this program where we are able to identify the needs of the outer islanders. So in the sense, there's 26 or so atolls in RMI. We're working on the 24 outer atolls, which is about a third of the population, and being able to ensure that each person is getting 20 liters of water per day, even if it doesn't rain for 4 months. So creating, again, with that scientific basis and analysis, and then building it into working with the communities and, of course, government-led, we're able to create an investment and now deploying that investment at scale so that 100% of these outer islanders, or nearly 100% of them, will have that resource, which is so precious for life. So to me, that's when I'm talking about adaptation at scale. It's talking about really unpacking the issue, finding what the issue is, getting the good science that will allow us to, make sure in 10, 20, 30 years, this is still going to be a sustainable option. And then, obviously it comes down to money, finding resources, and then deploying it. So yeah, those are two projects that are happening in the Pacific that I think really show potential of what we need to do more of. That's the type of thing we need to replicate.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing these two projects. Really, really interesting work. Correct me if I'm wrong, but could you quickly go back to Tuvalu? Is that also the country that is working to recreate their country digitally?
So yeah, this some digital transformation or digital future, and we actually, as part of our global strategy for UNDP in the United Nations Development Program, we look at digitalization as an enabler for all development, and so we try to integrate it into everything that we're doing. And particularly in Tuvalu, yeah, they're talking about a digital nation and looking at ensuring, my understanding of it is that, there's this cultural heritage that needs to be, archived and kept for future generations. And actually, it's so important because putting it in digital mode to the extent possible allows it to then be intergenerational. And I know, for instance, one of the stories that I've heard quite often in the Pacific around cultural heritage and maintaining it is, unfortunately, in the 2000s in Niue, there was a massive cyclone and the waves overtopped the island, and actually the National Museum was destroyed. And so, I mean, the devastation of that to a community, there's no price tag for that. And that's what we call in climate change discussions loss and damage, because that is a loss. Like there's no way to replace that. So although digital won't solve all issues, it definitely provides opportunities to make sure information is preserved over time. So yeah, digital is really important, and we do it throughout all our work, both in the peace, the prosperity, the planet. Yeah, really, really important.
Amazing. And, I'm also just curious, just because thinking about, being able to raise the island like another 6 feet and letting it, being able to sustain that till 2100, that's really amazing. I don't know if you have any of the specific information on that, but what kind of materials was used to lift the island 6 feet?
Yeah. So look, it's actually very interesting. So what we did is there's a massive lagoon there, and there is a massive volume of sand in there. So what we were actually in very, non-engineering terms, rather than putting like a seawall right on the shore, we put the seawall out from the shore and then filled in, you know, all that area with sand and then rose it up. And we used like less than, I don't have the exact number, but it was like less than 0.03% of the sand resources from, the lagoon. And we were able to extract it sustainably without affecting the environment, which was also a critical piece of the puzzle. And so, yeah, that roughly, basically, we filled in this area and then put enough in to raise it up high enough. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. And even talking about drought and water security, those are also things that we face here in the Hawaiian Islands. Around summertime, we often get notices from the Board of Water Supply asking us to conserve water in certain areas. We even have drought monitors that usually, when it's not the rainy season, you can see these red splotches all over the islands indicating drought and dry conditions. I mentioned all of this because I was hoping you could detail a little bit more about these drought conditions and what is causing this and what can we do to kind of help it.
Well, look, first of all, it's interesting what you mentioned about your drought monitoring and that system. And that is fantastic that Hawaii has that and that it's communicated out to the communities. Because one of the first things you need to do is have early warning systems. so people can change their behaviors. And these are the types of resources we need in these other countries, is to be able to do something similar so that there can be that warning. And that's something that is super important, that these systems aren't necessarily all in place and do need to be augmented. I mean, very interesting that yesterday I happened to be talking with someone from the U.S. Geological Society out of Hawaii, sharing some of this information around, how the drought monitoring, how do we do that in the context of the Marshall Islands. So, I actually think there's a lot of knowledge and experience and technical expertise in Hawaii, and the similarities here can be really valuable. So actually, this is a little shout out to your, people, like, with UNDP, we want to partner, with others to, with information and being able to share technical experience and knowledge so that we can help the people, here in the Pacific Islands here. So yeah, just on that drought monitoring, it's really very important that that type of data is around. What is causing this drought? I mean, look, right now we're in the middle of a El Nino, and so what we're seeing is, just very briefly and hopefully not very scientifically, there's a big pool of warm water in the Pacific, and during El Nino, it moves to the east. And as it moves to the east, the clouds follow where that warm water is, because that's where it evaporates. And where that clouds go, then you have the rain. So right now, during El Nino, all that that warm water and the clouds and the rain have shifted to the east. And so for Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands, we're getting a lot less rain than we're used to. The El Nino effect happens on a variable scale, but around every 7 years or so. Again, I mentioned earlier, I first arrived in the Pacific in 1998 in the middle of a strong El Nino. So right now, what we see is that El Nino will persist through the end of March, is what I understand from the scientists, and also that there's a potential that it lasts through mid-year. And so what we're trying to do is get in front of it and say, okay, there will be this water stress. What systems are in place to be able to respond to it both immediately, but what happens as it progresses as well too. So it's us working with government and many development partners to try to help support those impacts that are happening, but also that we can kind of see are coming up potentially here, particularly in these three countries at this point. So yeah, that's how we're looking at this. And the linkage to climate change is that the El Nino is obvious. It's an interaction between the ocean and the atmosphere. And so what happens is now you're seeing that these types of impacts like El Nino, these are becoming more frequent, more intense, and then again, it's a bit of a look into the future of more of these types of events. So we really have to build resilience and sustainability into the work that's happening, so that in the future we don't get into these sort of disaster situations.
Yeah, in our last couple of minutes, we kind of mentioned it before, but I was hoping you could really emphasize, why should people care about what's happening in the Pacific? I think it's really easy for an everyday person, let's say someone on the continent or somewhere else in the world, they can be like, oh, these islands are so far away. They don't really relate to us. But, with all the things that you've been saying, they really do and do have an impact. Can you kind of hone in on that connection and any more ways that people around the world, people living there now, possible solutions or things that they're working on just to help make an impact?
It goes back a little bit to what I said earlier about, the Pacific being a microcosm for what is and can happen globally as well, or will happen globally. And I think what I really think about is going back to Fiji, when they were leading this international meeting on climate change back a few years ago, and they had a slogan, "We are all in the same canoe." And I think this is really important because we're all on this planet together. And as the former Secretary General used to say, there's no planet B. So honestly, we all need to be working together, and it will, what we do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which can be through, where we spend our money. Are we spending on sustainable products, and how we invest, etc. Where are we doing that? Because it's going to help us locally, but it's also going to help here in the Pacific. And the other thing too is, listen to the Pacific. So, this is for those decision makers and those ones that are working, at that global level. Listen to the Pacific Islands, what they have to say, what is happening here, and the solutions that they've come up with. And I wanted to end with sort of 2 points. One more with my UNDP hat on, and one more with my the fact that I'm a naturalized citizen to the Pacific, Samoan. So the first one is more with UNDP, and climate isn't just a environmental crisis, but it's a social, economic, and political implications that affect the most vulnerable people: women, children, those people with disabilities, and those with the least resources. And it exasperates these inequalities in society. So these are things that we really need to be working on seriously through our programming, not just in the environment area, but the work we do in governance, promoting peace, how we do economic development. It actually runs through all those things. And so, UNDP does remain committed to working with communities and governments in the Pacific to build this resilient future and ensuring no one is left behind. And that last piece of the puzzle is super important for us as the United Nations. We always say, leave no one behind, or LNOB, and this is super important. And maybe then my last point, and a little bit of reflection. And so I've had a really amazing opportunity, and it was back in 2007 when I had an audience with His Highness Tui Atua Tupua Tamasese, the head of state of Samoa. And during that time, he shared with me some, about this indigenous concept of peace in the Samoan Islands. And in that, he was talking about these 4 harmonies, and that if you have these 4 harmonies, you will have peace. And I think it really encapsulates something that works for Samoa, but honestly, I think it works for the world, and something that we should be looking at. And so the first harmony is around the harmony with ourselves. We have to be, at peace with who we are, what we're doing, how we're contributing to society. The second one is harmony with the community around us. So the people we interact with, who are the people that are we making a change with in this world and living with? The third one is the harmony with the environment. We are part of this environment. We need to be protecting it. We need to be building systems that augment and strengthen our environment, not degrade it. And finally, the harmony with the cosmos. And so that spiritual side of, the connection that we have as individuals to something greater than us. And if you're able to have those 4 harmonies in line, then that is what you create peace with. So I really wanted to share that, and I do it very humbly because that information has really affected me in terms of how I look at development and how we try to approach things, or how I try to approach things as a development professional in the Pacific for over 2 decades. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. I love that. And I think that's such a great way to leave our viewers with all this great information that we were able to tackle. Thank you just so much again for taking the time to talk story with me. I definitely learned a lot, and it's really awesome to just hear the amazing work that you and your team and other environmentalists are doing to preserve and protect the rest of the Pacific. Thank you so much for your time, and, stay in touch. Thanks so much, Kevin.
Yeah, that's great, Emily. Really appreciate the chance to have this conversation with you. And yes, I hope maybe when I'm coming to Hawaii, maybe I'd get a chance to see you sometime.
For more stories like these, or for more episodes of Repairing Earth, head to hawaiinewsnow.com or listen wherever you get your podcasts. This is your host, Emily Cristobal, and mahalo for listening.